Well, hello and welcome. My name is Brian Captain. I'm editor of The Banker magazine. And I'm here with two of my colleagues today, Silvia Pavoni, who's the investment editor of The Banker, and Paul Wallace, who's the Africa editor. And we're going to be discussing the kinds of issues that the participants will be engaged with at the annual meetings of the IMF, World Bank, which are going to be held in Washington at the end of the month. Clearly, it's been a very heavy news agenda over the summer. We've seen the US debt downgraded. We've seen all the action and uprising in Libya and other parts of the Middle East. But critically speaking, we've seen this ongoing crisis over the Eurozone. And I think I'm right in saying that probably the Eurozone will be the chief talking point in Washington at the end of September. So, Paul, it has gone from, one day we seem to be kind of, on the shore of safety, and then suddenly we're back into turmoil with the markets going down, and then there's big political discussions and, there's announcements, but it doesn't really seem to satisfy anybody. I mean, do you see any kind of early resolution to the Eurozone crisis, or do you think we're in for a long, hard year or two when things don't really get much better?
I think we're in for a long, hard year or two at least. The big issue at the moment is the yields on Italian and Spanish government bonds. They widened significantly about two months ago. The ECB started buying Italian and Spanish bonds about a few weeks ago, and their yields have now, their 10-year yields have stabilized at about 5%. They were at about 6%, which many people said was unsustainable in the long run.
And one of the ideas has been that there should be a Eurobond backed by all the countries, and that would suddenly satisfy the markets. Do you think that that would do the trick, and do you think that it's a likely prospect?
A lot of people think it would be a cure-all tool for the Eurozone. There are a lot of things in its favour. As a whole, the Eurozone countries aren't that indebted. Taken together, their debt to GDP ratio is about 85%, which is less than the US. It's only slightly above the UK's debt to GDP ratio. Together, they only have a budget deficit of about 4%, which again isn't that bad. So a lot of people think that creating a Eurobond, which would be backed by the most creditworthy nations in the Eurozone, such as Germany,
would help to spread some confidence.
Yes,
yeah,
and
okay.
by also...
And you mentioned there about the European Central Bank intervening in the markets, and it's worth mentioning that the cover story of The Banker for our September issue, which is our IMF World Bank issue, looks at the whole aspect of central banks getting themselves into deep water. Because we think they're taking on rather a risky role by buying all these sovereign bonds. Now, Silvia, the next governor of the central bank is actually going to be Mario Draghi, an Italian, and you're from Italy, and I know you were there recently. How are Italians feeling about this ongoing crisis and Italy being dragged into the Eurozone crisis?
Well, typically, when looking at a country from abroad, the picture seems worse than what it is if you are actually within the specific markets. So it seems like Italians are looking at this vast amount of troubles that they are in a softer way than the rest of us. But still, the situation is pretty dire. The budget that the finance minister, Giulio Tremonti, brought in earlier this summer didn't have the effects that it was hoped, and in fact, Mario Draghi, the current central banker for Italy and the future head of the European Central Bank, was instrumental in pushing for further cuts and increasing the tightening of the public finances, and this has reassured in a way markets. But the wide number of small companies, which represents the vast majority of the Italian economy, are going to suffer. They have been suffering throughout the beginning of the financial crisis and then the economic downturn, and it is not expected that the situation is going to be any rosier for them anytime soon.
Okay, interesting you mentioned that small companies are the backbone of the Italian economy, because you also cover Latin America, and I think we shouldn't get so carried away with the Eurozone crisis that we don't forget that there are great parts of the world that are still growing strongly, and Latin America is one of them. And I know that in the current issue you've got an article about Brazilian growth companies. Are we starting to see the same kind of phenomena in Brazil, where the economy is starting to be powered by these small entrepreneurial companies?
Well, the Brazilian economy apparently is also being strongly biased towards the small companies. So Brazil has a bunch of international massive giants, but
like CBRD,
of course,
and
Petrobras, Vale,
yeah.
And others.
Yeah,
and,
sorry, Vale it's called now. Yeah, I'm showing my age. Yeah.
Yes. But it is estimated that 80% of jobs being created in Brazil are through small and medium-sized companies. So what these SMEs are worried about should really concern the whole of the country.
But one of the big problems in Brazil is apart from the bureaucracy and the tax and things, but it's the high cost of financing, isn't it, for a small company? You know, if you've got to pay some of the world's highest interest rates to get your money, how can you ever make a business successful?
So one of the peculiarities of the Brazilian market is that the interest rates are so high for a number of reasons. If an international company, a large exporter can afford to pay such high rates, or anyway has access to the international capital markets for funding, it's a different story. When we talk about small companies, they often cannot afford to repay such high interest, and in fact a bunch of small entrepreneurs I spoke to define the interest rates as suicidal even. So just to give a sense of how dire the situation is, or how dire the
But you are starting to get the development of private equity and venture capital firms in Brazil, which is a new thing, yeah?
It is definitely a new thing. So the private equity and venture capital market has been there for, let's say, 15 years, but it has been dormant. And only recently, the high growth that the Brazilian economy has been generating has also attracted lots of international private equity venture capitalist firms from abroad, and a bunch of the local banks and local firms have also set up specific funds to help these companies.
Okay, well, it's good that we've got countries like Brazil that are still growing rapidly in order to put us through the current crisis. That was always the hope. Now, Paul, you cover Africa, and we've seen some very high growth rates in Africa. But at the same time, I mean, Africa just does suffer from some long sort of running historical problems. You know, it's got a lot of small countries. It's got a lot of sort of trade barriers. Are we seeing African countries starting to take initiatives so that they can generate more internal trade and growth, which would help them?
Yes, as you say, African countries have been growing very quickly in recent years. Sub-Saharan African countries are expected to grow about 6% in real terms over the next few years, which is very rapid. But they do suffer from a lack of integration. Only about 12% of African trade is within the continent itself. That's the lowest rate of intra-regional trade in the world. EU members, by comparison, carry out about 65% of their trade with one another. There are a lot of initiatives going on at the moment. Recently, in July, negotiations were launched towards establishing what will be called a grand free trade area, or a tripartite free trade area, which will combine 26 African countries. It will literally go from Cape to Cairo, combining.
All right. Now that's very ambitious, isn't it? I mean,
it is.
We've seen smaller trade groupings in Africa, like the East African community, work reasonably well. But the idea of doing one across 54 countries, isn't that a little bit ambitious?
Yes, it is. The Grand FTA will be 26 countries, but still a lot of people...
So half, in other words, yeah.
Yes, but a lot of people are saying that even though there's a lot of potential, you're combining Egypt and South Africa, which are the two biggest economies on the continent. They're saying the more countries you have, the longer decision-making takes, and the less efficient the bodies become, and essentially it becomes almost arguments take over, and there's not enough progress on practical issues.
Yeah. Now I know that you've written an article about these developments for the Banker magazine's September issue, and you interviewed Professor Paul Collier of the University of Oxford, who's an expert on these matters. He was talking about the need for Africa to build bigger cities in order to raise productivity. That's quite a startling assertion, isn't it? Because some of us associate cities with a lot of social problems. What's his thinking behind that?
Yes, he said that there was a lack of megacities in Africa, and he said this was primarily due to a lack of migration caused by physical barriers, borders, and things between countries. And he said that this is a problem because the bigger cities get, the more productive and efficient they become. And he contrasted Africa to India, which, given its size, India has far more mega cities. And he said that integration would greatly help African cities build up. And he thinks that about 85% of cities on the continent would get bigger the more integration took place on the continent.
Okay, now one of the things we pride ourselves at the Banker is covering a huge range of geographical territory. And Sylvia, I know that you were in Paraguay earlier this year and conducted a big round table looking at Paraguay's developments. Not a country that many people visit or people know much about. I mean, can you give us a very sort of quick feel for what's happening in Paraguay at the moment?
Paraguay is a very interesting country. Some people say that it his people suffer of underestimating what their potential actually is, and you can have a feel for this when you visit the country. So it's a country that has the size of Germany, of Japan, but with a population of only 7 million people, and the rest is land, which tends to be fertile. And the methods of actually exploiting the land are not particularly efficient, so that you can see that there can be even greater productivity if more of these techniques
so
are improved.
So they could almost take a leaf out of Brazil's book, haven't they, where they've really very successfully applied mainstream technology to the agricultural sector.
So their model can be definitely replicated, and the prices for investing in Paraguay are definitely much lower than the ones of investing in Brazil. In fact, you can't really find anything in Brazil
okay,
any longer.
It's good that there are still places where there are big investment opportunities.
Yes.
Clearly, I mean, I think some of these things will come out at the meeting, but definitely there will still be, I think, a lot of gloom according to the Eurozone crisis. Paul, you've written a bit about the problems facing IPOs in the markets at the moment. Do you see any resolution of that situation at the moment, where companies be able to raise finance, or is that still under the cloud of the euro?
It's very much still under the clouds because of the jitters caused to equity markets by the Eurozone crisis. IPO markets globally didn't have a great first half of the year. Volumes in Asia and the US were a little bit higher than last year, but there were a lot of high-profile deals pulled. Europe had a terrible first half of the year. And the fall in equity markets at the beginning of August has really shattered hopes that the IPO market will be reignited
soon,
before the end of the year.
Okay, well, we've got a few weeks to go before the meeting starts. The markets can go through many somersaults before then, but we're looking forward to having a big team in Washington from the Banker, and also presenting the participants with one of our biggest issues ever. It's 176 pages. So hopefully it'll be a very insightful meeting.